Airbrush tip dry is one of the most common complaints among those just starting out and those who are switching over from urethanes to acrylics. So within this video, I'm going to show you exactly what it is, how to manage it, and why it's actually not that big of a deal. It might be annoying, yes, but once you understand what tip dry is and what's going on, it's very, very easy to handle. When you're painting with a water-based acrylic, you may not be able to eliminate tip dry, but you can easily eliminate any of the problems or headaches caused by it. So now for this little demo, I'm using Createx illustration colors. This is opaque white directly from the bottle. I'm spraying this through my Iwata Custom Micron Takumi, which has a 0.18 millimeter needle and nozzle. And because this paint isn't reduced, I'm spraying at a slightly higher PSI, 27, 28, somewhere around there. And that higher PSI will just help to atomize that thicker paint a little bit better. So if you're just starting out and you're wondering what tip dry is, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's paint that dries on the tip of the airbrush needle while you're spraying. So to show what it is, I set up a shot here with my macro lens filming at 120 frames per second. This way you could see exactly how tip dry builds up on the end of the airbrush needle in slow motion. When you press down and pull back on the airbrush trigger, the needle is going to slightly retract, creating a small opening for the paint. That airflow over the nozzle and needle tip will start to draw the paint from that small opening from the Venturi effect and atomize it into the air. And that's exactly what you're seeing here in this macro shot of the airbrush needle. And so while you're spraying with an airbrush, a small amount of that paint is going to cling to the needle tip. And the air from the airbrush is going to start drying that paint. And that's what you're seeing here. That's tip dry. And this is only like 30 seconds to a minute after spraying this water-based paint. You can see that the needle is really starting to get caked up. And if I speed up the video, spray for another minute or so, you can see how much paint built up on this needle. And this tip dry is going to start to cause a lot of problems if you don't remove it from the needle. You may think there's something wrong with your airbrush or something wrong with the paint. This tip dry, this paint on the end of the needle, is going to restrict the path of that atomized paint. So you may start to think that there's something wrong with your airbrush, like it's spraying less paint, spraying unevenly or at an angle. Or you may even start to notice a stippling effect where you're seeing large globs of paint rather than finely atomized particles. And this is all a result of tip dry, dried paint on the end of the needle tip. Now, I personally only use water-based paints and I never have problems with tip dry. The reason for that is very simple. I constantly clean it off. If you're using a water-based acrylic paint, you're going to have to get in the habit of constantly cleaning that tip dry off. It's something that almost becomes second nature. I'm doing it every few minutes. I don't even realize I'm doing it anymore. Most of the time, I just clean tip dry off with my fingers. I'll just lightly pinch off any dried paint with my fingertips or fingernails and then get back to painting. But you need to be very careful here, not only to not stab yourself with that very sharp needle, but also not to damage it. You need to be very gentle, especially with a micron with a 0.18 or an infinity with a 0.15. But my favorite way to remove all that dried paint and tip dry is to use a toothbrush. Paint not only dries on the needle tip as tip dry, but you'll also commonly see it building up around the end of the nozzle cap. And so if you take a toothbrush wetted with some water or airbrush cleaner, you can clean this tip dry off in a matter of seconds and get right back to painting. A toothbrush not only removes all of that paint from the needle tip, the tip dry, but it also removes any of the paint from the nozzle cap. It's also very gentle, so you don't have to worry about damaging that delicate needle. The nice thing about a toothbrush is that it works very well with the needle cap on or off the airbrush. The needle cap, like this crown cap on the Krios 289, protects the end of the needle. So if you accidentally bump your airbrush into the substrate that you're painting, that needle is going to be safe from damage. Now, I always paint with that needle cap off. I remove it from all of my airbrushes. And the only reason for that is because I can easily see my needle tip with it off. When the needle cap is off, it's just so much easier to spot any dried paint on the nozzle or needle tip and just remove it. But if you're just starting out, even for the first year or so, I highly, highly recommend leaving that needle cap on. It'll just give you some security knowing that that needle tip is always going to be safe because it's so easy to bend or break if you bump it into the surface without that guard on. And a toothbrush with some water or airbrush cleaning solution works just as well with the needle cap on the airbrush. Just be gentle with it, make a few passes, and then once you're done, make sure you aim it away from your artwork and spray. Some of that water or airbrush cleaner is going to stay on here, so you want to make sure you blow that off before you aim it at your artwork. I've unfortunately made this mistake so many times. It's an awful feeling when you see some airbrush cleaner shoot onto your painting. So again, just aim it in another direction, maybe onto a paper towel, scrap piece of paper, and blow off any of that extra water or cleaner. Another very good option to clean off tip dry is a Q-tip or a cotton swab. Just dip it in some water or cleaning solution and then gently run it over the needle to remove any of that excess paint. A Q-tip works well on one of these 2-prong nozzle caps that you'll see on like Harder and Steenbeck or Badger airbrushes. And it also works very well if the needle cap's removed, but if you do have the needle cap on, you're going to need something different like a toothbrush or a paintbrush. And that's going to be my last suggestion, just a basic synthetic paintbrush. Any paintbrush will do for this. I prefer a round one, so this is a number 5 round by Blick. And it's just a cheap student grade paintbrush. You could buy a bunch of these for like $5-10 bucks. Whatever tool you use to clean off tip dry, just remember to be very gentle with that needle tip. When I use a toothbrush or a cotton swab, I'm usually just using water. Just plain old tap water or distilled water works very, very well to remove that paint. But if you need something a little bit more aggressive, this Iwata airbrush cleaner works very, very well. Another option that I love for Createx paints is using 4012 reducer. I wasn't crazy about this as an actual reducer, but I found it to be an amazing cleaner. It's aggressive enough to clean off the paint, but it's not going to damage any of the seals in the airbrush. So if you need something a little bit stronger, these are going to be my 2 recommendations, but honestly, just try water first. Like I said, I only use acrylic paints, and for like 95% of my cleaning, I'm just using distilled water. Tip dry is always going to be part of painting with an airbrush, especially if you're using water-based paints. So just learning to keep on top of it, get in the habit of cleaning it off, and that's going to eliminate any of the problems that are caused by tip dry. But besides cleaning it off, there are a few other things that could help. The first one, and this is a very important one, is good airbrush spraying technique. What I mean by that is to first press down on the airbrush trigger so that the airbrush is continually spraying air. And with that trigger pressed down, when you pull back, the airbrush is going to start atomizing, spraying that paint. But the important part is learning to stop the paint. And so in order to stop the paint, you always want to move your trigger finger fully forward so that it's no longer spraying paint. Only then do you lift your trigger finger up to stop the air. If you release the air when the trigger is fully retracted and spraying paint, you're going to end up with a big glob of paint on that airbrush needle. And if you let that paint sit for like 15 or 20 minutes, it's going to dry on the needle tip. And if that paint doesn't dry and you start spraying again, the air from the airbrush is going to shoot that paint forward, and that airbrush is going to spit the paint directly onto your artwork or the model that you're painting. So in order to avoid any of this trouble, just use some good trigger technique. To start, down for air first, then pull back for paint. To stop, push the trigger fully forward so that the airbrush isn't spraying paint anymore, and only then do you lift your trigger finger up to stop the air. It's very simple to do. If you're just starting out, you'll get a hang of it in no time. And one final thing that could help with tip dry is just to reduce your paint. Thin it out 10-20%. I know that there's a lot of recipes out there for homemade reducers, but honestly, I don't recommend using any of those. I highly recommend sticking with a reducer that the paint manufacturer created for their paints. Or if you're using a water-based acrylic, just use distilled water. For example, one of my favorite paints, Golden High Flow Acrylics, they recommend using distilled water to reduce their paints. For the illustration colors, Createx recommends using their 4011 reducer. And so that's all I ever used, distilled water for acrylic paints or the reducer that the manufacturer specifically created for their paint line. And so that's going to be it for this week's video. Remember that tip dry is unavoidable when painting with an airbrush, but it's very, very easy to manage. So try a few of the tips out that I showed in this video, and I bet you that your tip dry problems will be a thing of the past. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you picked something up, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you to everyone who subscribed to this channel, and thank you so much to the channel members for their generous support. I'd like to personally welcome the 2 newest members this week, Matthew and Todd. Thank you so much, guys, for joining, and welcome. And I'd like to give a shout out to Daz, who rejoined at a very generous tier 3 a few weeks ago. So thank you so much, man. I appreciate that. Have a great week, everybody. I'll see you back here next Friday.